A heavy door shut somewhere inside a government building. No shout, no chaos, just a click, and a silence that means power changed hands. June 1953, Moscow. A closed meeting of the Soviet leadership. A man walks in expecting procedure, paperwork, arguments, votes. He's the one everyone fears most. Not because he's the loudest, because he's the one with the files. And in the next minutes, the room flips. Guards appear, a command is given, and the most dangerous man in the Soviet Union is suddenly just a man standing in the wrong place. This isn't the story of a battlefield, it's the story of a room, and a regime so fragile that a single meeting can decide whether a superpower becomes a police state forever. To understand why that moment matters, you have to rewind 113 days. March 5th, 1953. Joseph Stalin dies. And for a brief, terrifying window, the Soviet Union has no gravity. The empire still looks solid from the outside. Flags, parades, borders. But inside, everyone is doing the same calculation. Who controls the next morning? Because when dictators die, the question isn't who's the best leader, it's who controls information, who controls movement, who controls fear. And in 1953, the man best positioned to control all three is Lavrentiy Beria, the architect of the security machine, now moving to take the machine off the leash. After Stalin's death, the Soviet security organs are reshuffled, and Beria rises fast. He becomes the face of order, the man who can open prison doors or fill them. To everyone else in that room, he isn't a colleague, he's a countdown. So this is our premise. A dictator dies, and the man with the secret police almost takes the entire state. And the only thing standing between transition and permanent terror is whether the room chooses to move first. Stalin's death doesn't bring relief. It brings a silence so unnatural, the whole system starts listening for the next sound. Because the Soviet Union wasn't designed to function like a normal state. It was designed to function like a man's shadow. Stalin sat at the center of everything. Appointments, punishments, promotions, arrests. Every ambitious official learned the same survival skill. Guess what he wanted before he said it. And then, suddenly, he's gone. No successor is crowned. No clear transfer is announced. Just a leadership circle full of men who have spent decades learning how to survive around a predator, now trapped in a room together without him. In those first days, power in Moscow becomes a strange kind of physics. Not based on popularity, not based on law, based on control. Control of who gets to speak, control of who gets to move, control of who gets to exist tomorrow. That's why, in the immediate aftermath, the most dangerous person is not the one with the best speeches or the biggest title. It's the one with the organs that can make people disappear. Lavrentiy Beria had spent years building and managing the security apparatus, an engine of surveillance, interrogation, arrests, and fear. When people heard his name, they didn't imagine a politician. They imagined a knock on the door at night. They imagined a file being opened. They imagined a car idling outside. And after Stalin dies, Beria moves into a position that looks, on paper, like a bureaucratic promotion, but in reality is something much darker. He gains direct leverage over the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the police and security systems that decide who is safe and who is enemies. In a state like the USSR, that isn't just power. That's the ability to rewrite reality. Because if you control the security machine, you control the story the country is allowed to tell itself. You can label rivals as traitors. You can manufacture confessions. You can stage emergencies that justify temporary measures. And you can do it quickly, fast enough that everyone else is reacting instead of planning. Here's the twist that makes this period so terrifying. Beria doesn't present himself as a cartoon villain. He presents himself as a stabilizer, a man of order, a man who can fix what Stalin broke. He hints at reforms. He talks about easing pressure. He positions himself as the adult in the room who can calm the system down. But everyone around him understands the threat beneath the words. Because a man like Beria doesn't need to declare a dictatorship. He can let the security apparatus become the dictatorship, quietly, legally, procedurally. And the men sitting around him in those meetings know something else too. If Beria wins, there will not be another meeting like this. There will not be a second chance. So, in the weeks after Stalin's death, Moscow doesn't just enter a power struggle, it enters a race between the man who controls fear and the men who are trying to survive long enough to stop him. And that brings us to the question at the heart of this story. How do you remove the most feared man in the country when he controls the machine that removes people? In a normal government, leadership changes are public. In Stalin's USSR, leadership changes were a private war conducted with paperwork, whispers, and fear. After the funeral, the Soviet Union tries to look stable. Meetings are held, titles are assigned, statements are issued. The outer shell stays intact. But inside that shell, everyone is watching one man. Because Beria understands something essential about power in a frightened system. You don't need to be loved. You only need to be unavoidable. And in the weeks after Stalin's death, Beria starts making himself unavoidable. He moves fast. He begins presenting himself as the solution to the country's exhaustion. Less terror, more order, fewer random purges, a return to something resembling normal life. He talks like a man who wants to clean up the mess. And for a moment, it works. People are so traumatized by the last years of Stalin's rule that the idea of relief is intoxicating. The country doesn't trust him, but it wants to believe a nightmare might finally be loosening its grip. That's the danger, because in a regime built on fear, relief can be the most effective weapon. It lowers defenses. It makes people hesitate. It makes rivals wonder if fighting you will make them look like the problem. So, Beria starts doing things that sound humane, but also serve a strategic purpose. Prison policies shift. Certain cases are reviewed. Some pressure eases. The security state appears to soften. But he is not dismantling the machine. He's rebranding it. And while he sells stability, he is also collecting leverage. He knows who is afraid. He knows who has blood on their hands. He knows which officials are most vulnerable to exposure and which ones can be bought with protection. Because Beria's real strength isn't the gun, it's the file. A file is a weapon you can fire later. A file is a threat you don't have to speak out loud. A file is how you turn colleagues into hostages. And the Soviet leadership understands this. Every man around that table has lived through years where a single accusation can end a life. So when Beria begins acting like the future is already his, the others do what people do under intimidation. They cooperate. Not because they agree, because they are afraid of being the first to resist. That is how authoritarian power consolidates, not with mass support, with mass hesitation. But here's the detail that Beria miscalculates. In those same meetings, while he is performing reform, the others are watching him with a very specific kind of fear. Not fear that he will rule, fear that he will rule forever. Because if Beria wins, the Soviet Union doesn't just continue, it hardens. The security apparatus becomes the center of gravity, the party becomes decoration, and every official becomes one mistake away from disappearance. So, the men around him begin to share a silent understanding. If we don't stop him now, we will never stop him. And that's when the counterforce begins to form. Quietly, carefully, in a system where one wrong word can be fatal. Because to remove Beria, you can't just outvote him. You have to do something far more dangerous. You have to move first. Stopping Beria was not like opposing a normal politician. You couldn't confront him publicly. You couldn't debate him into submission. You couldn't even be sure your own office wasn't wired. Because Beria's entire advantage was visibility into other people's lives. He could see secrets. He could manufacture evidence. He could arrest a man and rewrite the reason later. So the men who feared him most had a brutal problem to solve. How do you remove the one person who controls the police without being arrested by the police? The first step was psychological. They had to accept a truth most people avoid. If you wait for certainty, you are already dead. Because the moment Beria felt a coordinated threat, he would strike first. He wouldn't argue, he would purge. So the counterforce couldn't be broad, it couldn't be messy, it couldn't leak. It had to be a small circle of men with enough authority to act and enough discipline to stay silent. And they needed one crucial thing, a force Beria did not command. In 1953, Beria's power rested on the internal security apparatus. But there was another instrument in the Soviet state, one with weapons, manpower, and legitimacy that did not automatically obey him: the military. The army had been traumatized by Stalin too, but it was not Beria's personal tool the way the security organs were. And that meant if Beria's rivals could align the military behind them, Beria could be isolated. Not because the military was noble, because the military didn't want to live under a police state any more than the party did. They had their own fear, the fear that Beria would turn them into servants of the secret police. So the counterforce begins to form around a simple strategy. Don't fight the security machine head-on. Cut its head off in one motion. That requires timing. It requires a controlled environment, a place where Beria feels safe enough to show up without his full protective grip. And it requires speed, because the longer the confrontation takes, the more time Beria has to use what he always used: confusion, delay. The suggestion that resisting him is illegal, because that was his favorite weapon. Not tanks, not guns. Inevitability, the feeling that he is the state, and refusing him is refusing reality. So the only viable plan is to trap him inside procedure itself. Call a meeting, make it formal, make it routine, make it the kind of room where obedience is automatic. Then, at the moment he least expects it, replace automatic obedience with a new command. Not to him, against him. That is why this story is not mainly about a monster's crimes. It's about a system so fragile that a handful of men have to stage a political ambush just to survive their colleague. And now we arrive at the hinge, a closed meeting, a heavy door, a man who thinks he's walking in to inherit the country. The meeting is called like any other. Same corridors, same guards, same heavy furniture, same ritual of men entering a room and pretending the room is in control. That's the genius of the trap. In a state like the Soviet Union, procedure isn't just tradition, it's camouflage. If something looks official, people stop asking whether it's safe. Beria walks in expecting what he's been expecting for weeks: cautious cooperation. The usual choreography where everyone pretends they agree because disagreement is dangerous. He believes the fear still belongs to him, and for a moment, everything feels normal. Papers are arranged, chairs scrape softly, faces keep their expressions neutral. Nobody looks like a man about to start a war inside a conference room. Because if anyone signals it too early, Beria doesn't need to win an argument. He just needs to leave. And if he leaves, the trap dies. This is the part people miss when they imagine power struggles. The most dangerous man in the country is not defeated by strength. He's defeated by timing. Accounts differ on the exact choreography, but the core mechanism is consistent. Beria's rivals move together in a coordinated strike, and they do it in a way that prevents him from turning the room into delay. A senior figure speaks first, calm, formal, unmistakably authoritative. Not an accusation shouted in anger, a declaration that Beria is no longer untouchable, that he is being removed, that the state he thought he controlled has decided in one motion to treat him as the threat. And that's when the air changes, because in these rooms, reality isn't created by truth, it's created by who gives orders and who obeys them. Beria tries the only moves he has ever needed. He leans on legality, on procedure, on the logic of the machine. He tries to frame resistance as a crime. He tries to turn the moment back into uncertainty, because uncertainty is where his power lives. But for the first time, the room doesn't hesitate. The room doesn't search his face for permission. The room doesn't wait for the security organs to rescue him. Instead, guards appear that are not there for him. They are there for the room. They are there to make sure the decision becomes physical before Beria can make it psychological. And in that instant, the man who built an empire out of fear experiences the one thing he never allowed other people to have: helplessness. Not because he suddenly becomes weak, but because the system he mastered has finally been used against him. The door that always opened for him becomes a door that closes behind him. And as he is taken out of the room, something becomes clear to everyone left inside. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a signal, a message to the entire Soviet elite that the security machine is no longer the center of gravity, that the age of the file decides everything has been interrupted. And after that, the fall happens fast, because once inevitability breaks, it doesn't wobble, it collapses. Once Beria is out of the room, the Soviet Union does what authoritarian systems always do after a violent correction. It rewrites the past at speed. Because the most dangerous thing in a regime built on fear is not the monster, it's the knowledge that the monster was allowed. Beria had been one of the most powerful men in the state for years. He didn't operate in secret. He operated with authority. His machinery didn't run on his personality, it ran on cooperation. So, after his arrest, the leadership has to perform a kind of emergency surgery on reality. They can't tell the country or the party that Beria was central to the system, because that would raise a question nobody wants to answer. If he was a criminal, what does that make everyone who served beside him? So the official story hardens into something simple. Beria becomes a singular villain, a traitor, a foreign agent, a monster who somehow infiltrated the state, corrupted it, and must now be removed like a disease. It's a convenient story because it saves everyone else. It turns the system into an innocent victim of one man, and it allows the leadership to claim moral authority without admitting complicity. But inside the Soviet elite, nobody believes the story is that clean. They understand the real meaning of Beria's fall. Fear can be redirected. It can be weaponized against the person who once wielded it. And that creates a new kind of danger. Because if the security machine can be turned against Beria, it can be turned against anyone. So what replaces him isn't freedom, it's a different arrangement of control. The leadership begins tightening its grip on the organs Beria once commanded, not because it wants to dismantle fear, but because it wants to own fear. They move quickly to separate, reorganize, and absorb the apparatus into structures that can't be dominated by one man again, or at least can't be dominated as openly. And in the public sphere, the relief is real, but it's cautious. People don't suddenly start speaking freely in the streets. They don't suddenly trust the future. They've lived too long in a world where the safest habit is silence. So Beria's removal becomes one of those historic moments that looks like a victory, but feels like a warning. Because it teaches a rule about authoritarian systems that is both hopeful and terrifying. Power is not always destroyed. Sometimes it is merely transferred, like a weapon passed from one hand to another. And now we reach the controlled turn of our channel, the alternate branch. Because in real history, the room moved first, the trap worked, Beria lost. But if we change just one thing, one hesitation, one delay, one failed coordination, the story flips. And the Soviet Union doesn't step away from the edge, it steps deeper into it. Now we take the controlled turn. Same corridor, same building, same meeting. But in this branch, the trap doesn't snap shut cleanly. It's not because Beria becomes braver, it's because his opponents become a fraction less coordinated. A sentence starts and doesn't land. A signal is delayed by seconds. A guard outside the room hesitates, waiting for confirmation. And in an authoritarian system, seconds are not just time, they are openings. Beria feels it instantly. He doesn't need to understand the whole plot. He only needs to recognize the shape of danger. And he does what he has trained himself to do for decades. He turns uncertainty into obedience. He raises his voice, controlled, not panicked, and demands procedure. He frames the attempt against him as illegal. He forces the room to hesitate by making everyone think about consequences. And while the room is thinking, he moves. Not dramatically, not with a gun, with a single order into the security apparatus that still answers to him. A phone call is placed. A message is carried. Doors that should have closed behind him stay open. And now the meeting becomes something else. Not a trap, a test. A test of who controls movement inside the state. In this branch, Beria reaches the corridor before the counterforce can lock him in place. And once he reaches the corridor, the balance changes. Because Beria doesn't need to win an argument inside a room. He needs to survive long enough to activate the machine outside the room. Within hours, the first wave hits, quiet and surgical. Not mass arrests, targeted removals. A deputy doesn't return home. A phone line goes dead. A driver is redirected and never seen again. The people who tried to coordinate against him discover the oldest truth in the Soviet system. The first strike is usually invisible. And once the first strike lands, fear does the rest. Beria then does something even more dangerous than revenge. He announces stability. He presents himself as the man who prevented a conspiracy from tearing the state apart. He claims to be defending order, defending the party, defending the country, defending the revolution. And he makes reforms that look merciful but function as traps. A limited amnesty that allows him to claim humanity while keeping the files. A reshuffle that looks like modernization while ensuring loyalty. A new security doctrine that is framed as temporary but written to renew itself. The Soviet Union, in this alternate branch, doesn't become strong again. It becomes rigid again. And the most important transformation isn't ideological, it's psychological. Ordinary people learn very quickly what kind of era this is. They stop speaking freely in public. They stop trusting private conversations. They stop expecting law to protect them. Because the law is now written by the same hand that holds the files. Beria doesn't need mass enthusiasm. He needs mass quiet, and he gets it. But the final twist remains the same as real history, only darker. Even with Beria winning, the Soviet Union isn't saved. It's postponed. Because you can't rebuild a collapsing economy, a collapsing union, and a collapsing legitimacy using fear as the glue. You can only hold the seams together long enough for the next rupture to be worse. And that leads us to the lesson. Not a movie lesson, a survival lesson. Here's the lesson of Beria: real timeline or alternate. The most dangerous power in a state is not the loud power, it's the quiet power, the power that doesn't need applause, the power that works through files, permissions, and fear. Beria's story isn't just a bad man was stopped, it's a warning about how systems become predatory. Because Beria didn't invent the machinery, he inherited it, improved it, and proved how useful it was. And that's the part people miss. A monster is terrifying. A monster with a system is unstoppable until the system hesitates. In the real timeline, the Soviet leadership understood one truth in time. You cannot outweight the man who controls fear. You have to coordinate, move first, and make the decision physical before he can make it psychological. In the alternate branch, the trap fails for one reason: hesitation. A fraction of delay, a moment where procedure is allowed to become uncertainty again. And uncertainty is where men like Beria live. So the survival lesson isn't be brave in a cinematic way. It's this: when you see power hardening into permanence, watch what it is trying to control first. Information, who is allowed to speak and who is punished for contradicting. Movement, who is allowed to gather, travel, organize, and return home. Legitimacy, who gets to define what is lawful and who gets labeled as a threat. If those three begin tightening at the same time, the system isn't responding to a crisis, it's building a new normal. Next episode, we stay in this season of hidden power, another hinge moment where a state didn't collapse with explosions. It collapsed with paperwork, silence, and fear. Subscribe, because in alternate realities, we don't just retell history, we learn the shape of the next emergency before it arrives.